Jake Reynolds had witnessed enough strange things in his years as a firefighter, but nothing like this. Story comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The husky stood still in the alleyway, soaked from nose to paw, its icy blue eyes staring straight at him. Its body quivered, fatigue settling in every bone, and around its neck, bound tight to a frayed leather collar, was a blood-stained note. Jake's pulse quickened. He had been answering a routine call, a possible fire in the old warehouse district. It wasn't unusual. Kids screwing around, squatters starting small fires to stay warm. Usually nothing serious. However, when they arrived, there was no fire, no smoke, nothing unusual seen on any of the outputs. Just the dog. Initially, he assumed it was wounded, but as he approached, he noticed something that left him feeling terrified. The blood wasn't coming from the husky. The rain hammered against Jake's helmet as he hesitated. The air smelled of dampness, of metal, the sort of odor that stuck to crime scenes. Something was wrong, very wrong. The next thing he felt was muscle memory, his fingertips skimming the chill, damp paper. It was wrinkled, the ink blurred, but the words were still readable. "If you find this dog, run." Jake's throat tightened. His eyes darted back and forth around the alley. Darkened windows, shuttered streets, the eerie luminescence of a wavering street lamp. Someone had abandoned this dog here, and whoever it was, they were still watching. The husky emitted a weak, pathetic whimper, barely raising up its head. However, in its eyes there was something else among the fatigue, urgency, desperation, a silent plea. With his heart hammering in his chest, Jake glanced back at the note. Run. From what? Something wasn't adding up. It had been years since the old warehouse district had been used, and the area decayed like a vestigial limb. No one who came through here was doing anything except being lost or hiding. And now there's a lone dog, a bloody collar, and a warning. Jake inhaled slowly, trying to compose himself. He had to move this dog out of here. Now, he bent down and gently lifted the husky into his arms. The dog recoiled but offered no resistance. It was too weak to fight. As he turned back toward his fire truck, he saw something in his peripheral vision. A shadow, a wave of motion at the end of the lane. He wasn't alone. Jake didn't think. He just did. He held the husky close and began to move, fast. But just as he reached the mouth of the alley, a sound froze him, a whisper. Hardly louder than the sound of the rain. You should not have picked him up. Jake spun around. Nothing. Just dark, the rain, the thrum of the city far away. He breathed in shallow gulps. He clutched the husky even tighter. He had learned to anticipate disaster in his firefighting training. But this was a different thing altogether. He had no idea what he had just confronted, but he was about to find out, and it would do everything differently. The voice was little more than a whisper, swallowed up by the sound of the rain. But Jake heard it, and it stopped him cold. He made a sound as if he had been punched in the throat. He could feel the frail husky in his arms tightening in submission. He turned and looked around the alleyway. Nothing but darkness, except the far-off drone of the city. And yet, the sensation of being watched hadn't departed him. Jake had fought through blazing infernos, dragged people from collapsed buildings, hawked face-to-face with death more times than he could remember. But this was different. The warehouse district was meant to be empty, but someone was here. Someone had intentionally abandoned this dog here, and whoever they were still nearby. He needed to move. Now, Jake spun on his heel, Stalking back to the fire truck, the husky made a meager whimpering noise and curled against his chest, scared, terrified. But just as he arrived at the truck, something made him stop again. A shadow, a flicker at the end of the alley. Jake's muscles tensed. His heart was thundering in his ears. For a moment he thought he was imagining it, that the rain was playing tricks on him, that it was some distortion of the flickering street lights. But then it moved. Not fast, not a blur, slow, deliberate, controlled. Jake's pulse spiked. There was someone there. He pulled open the fire truck door, slipping inside, clutching the dog tight to his chest. The moment the door slammed behind him, he locked it. Instinct. He had scarcely processed that when his partner, Mike, turned toward him from the driver's seat, scowling. "Dude, what the fuck happened? Where were you?" Jake barely looked at him. His eyes remained glued to the side mirror, scanning the alley. Empty. Had he imagined it? He gripped the damp fur of the husky tighter. It released a soft, exhausted breath, barely coordinating its limbs. "Just drive," Jake muttered. Mike shot him a look, but didn't argue. The engine roared to life. The fire truck rumbled away. Jake willed air into his lungs as they drove out of the alley. To think. But try as hard as he could, one question wouldn't go away. Who, no what, had been standing there? The vet. The car ride to the emergency vet was somber. The husky was still curled in Jake's lap, moving very little. The rise and fall of its chest so shallow it made his heart clench. He didn't even know how hard he was squeezing until he felt the dog's body move, a soft, pained whimper escaping. "My bad, bud," Jake said, loosening his grip. Mike continued to shoot him sidelong looks, but did not ask questions. Not yet. Within minutes, they arrived at the animal hospital. The second Jake got there, he hopped straight out, cradling the husky gently as they sped in. Even the front desk receptionist had little time to respond before he started talking. "I need a vet. Now." The woman paused, but then, looking at the half-unconscious dog in his arms, pressed a button on her phone. Moments later, a vet in scrubs arrived. "What happened?" the vet asked, already launching herself at the dog. Jake hesitated. Where did he even start? He swallowed hard, retreating as the vet gently removed the husky and placed him on an examination table. In came a second assistant in a hurry, checking the dog's vitals. "Severely dehydrated, hypothermic, malnourished," the vet said in a whisper, shining a light into the husky's unblinking blue eyes. But no visible wounds. The tension in Jake's chest eased slightly as he took a breath. But just as he was starting to relax, the vet's face changed. Something shifted. His brows furrowed. His hands stilled. His gaze was fixed on the husky's collar. Or, to be more precise, what was inside of it. The vet methodically unpinned it, turning the collar over in his hands as Jake hovered, and that's when he saw it. Inside the leather strap tucked just beneath the folds was another piece of paper. A note. Jake's breath hitched. The vet's eyes met his. Confused, concerned. Then, slowly, he unfolded it. The paper was limp, the edges tattered, the ink blurred by rain and time. But, as with the first note, the writing remained legible. Jake leaned forward, heart thudding. And when he read the message, he felt his blood drain cold. The words across the sodden paper struck Jake's skin like ice. He tightened his grip on the note. His breathing grew shallow. He read it again, and again, as though somehow the message would update. As if that would make more sense. It didn't. Jake looked up at the vet. The older gentleman had hardly moved, fixated on Jake, brows drawn tight with concern, gaze flitting up and down between Jake and the fallen husky on the table. "Is this some kind of joke?" the vet asked, his voice low. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep down, he already knew this was not a joke. Something was terribly wrong. The husky quivered slightly on the table, his breathing shallow and uneven. His fur was still wet from the rain, and his body seemed much too fragile for a dog of his size. But not just his condition had Jake on edge. It was his gut feeling, that indigestible nagging sense that this wasn't merely some mandate going to seed, that this dog had been left out for him to find. The warning in the alley, the shadow in the rain, the voice that said, "You shouldn't have picked him up." Now this. Jake's stomach twisted. The vet exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. Look, that doesn't make any sense medically. A dog that tired, that starved, he needs to sleep. Only thing that will sleep. No. Jake cut in. The vet blinked. Jake didn't even know he'd said that until he saw the man's reaction. His own voice had sounded sharper than he'd meant. For a moment, his muscles had all bunched up, like he was anticipating something he couldn't quite name. We can't let him sleep yet," Jake said, his voice quaking slightly. The vet didn't look convinced, but then something in Jake's tone must have persuaded him. He sighed slowly, readjusted his glasses, then turned back to the dog. "Fine, but if we're keeping him awake, we have to hurry." The vet signaled to his assistant. "We'll get him on fluids, we'll stabilize his vitals. But if he loses consciousness, we might lose him." Jake swallowed hard. He knew what the vet meant. That was something he had seen before, during fire rescues. And sometimes after fighting the battle between life and death, the body just closed up shop. It gave up. And then when that happened, there was no turning back. The idea sent a cold sweat running down his back. The husky made a low, barely audible whimper. His eyes blinked open for a moment, just a flash of pale blue, before his head drooped again, too weak, too close. Instinct took over, and Jake moved before he could think. He reached out, laying a hand against the dog's damp fur, gently brushing his fingers across his head. "Hey, buddy, stay with me, all right?" His tone was soft, but very firm, a command, a plea. The husky moved a little, one ear pricking at the sound of Jake's voice. A good sign. The vet nodded. "Keep talking to him. Keep him engaged." Jake didn't question it. He just did it. He told the husky his name. He mentioned the fire station to him, about the guys on his team, about the long shifts, the rescues, the stupid inside jokes they made to endure the worst days. And as he said that, he saw something. A flicker, a glimmer, nearly a flicker behind those weary blue eyes. He was listening, and that meant that he was still fighting. And then the lights flickered. The words died on Jake's lips. The vet looked up, his assistant frozen mid-step. The fluorescent overhead lights buzzed, dimmed for half a second, then stabilized. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But Jake noticed, because the moment the lights dimmed, the husky's breath changed. It was just for a moment, a fraction of a second, but Jake felt it. The dog's body tensed, his breath hitched, and for the briefest second, his eyes were wide with fear, like he had seen something, like he had felt something. The lights stabilized. The room returned to normal. But the chill in Jake's veins didn't go away. The vet cleared his throat. Just the storm playing with the power grid, probably. Jake nodded, but it wasn't true. Because in that instant, as the lights flashed, he had felt it too. A shift in the air, a sensation he could not articulate. Like something invisible had swept through the room, like they weren't alone. Jake exhaled slowly. The husky was still awake, still fighting, but something had shifted, The warning was not just a message. It was a countdown, and time was running out. Jake wasn't sure why, but the air grew heavier in the room, as though something hidden, invisible, and unlikely had drifted, settled over them like a black cloud. He rested his hand atop the husky's head and pressed down, feeling the dog's labored breathing under his fingertips. It was still fast, shallow, but most of all, it was alert. He was still awake, for now. But Jake couldn't rid himself of the sensation that something had just transpired, that the lights didn't dim just because of a power surge, that, for the briefest moment, something had been in the room with them. It was the vet who cleared his throat, shattering the silence. "I'm going to push the IV," he said, his tone measured, clinical. But Jake picked up on it, the barely restrained tension in his voice, that same unease settling in his own chest. He was not the only person to have sensed it. The assistant nurse went to change the fluids, but her hands were shaking. She blurted a curse under her breath, fumbled with the apportioned tube. Jake spoke before he could think better of it. "You felt it as well, didn't you?" The room stilled. The vet froze mid-motion. The assistant paused whatever she was doing. The only sound was the beeping of the monitors and the steady rise and fall of the husky's breath. The vet sighed, rubbing at the bridge of his nose. "Look, I don't know what's happening here, but something about this whole situation is odd. The dog, the notes, and now..." He waved vaguely at the ceiling, where the lights had just flickered. "I'm a man of science, Jake, but I would be lying if I said it didn't feel some kind of way just now." Jake nodded slowly. That was enough confirmation. He wasn't losing it. This was real. But what did it mean? Jake looked back at the husky. His fur remained damp with rain. His blue eyes were half-lidded with fatigue. But they were open, still fighting. "He's scared," Jake murmured. "Not just weak, actually terrified." The vet exhaled. "Then we need to know why that is, and fast." A strange mark. Jake stepped back and watched as the vet and his assistant worked. His gaze skittered every few seconds to the door, the windows, the corners of the room. That sensation, the one from the alley, had returned. He could sense something watching. But no matter how many times he turned, nothing was there. An icy shiver ran down his spine. The vet gasped suddenly, sharply. "What the hell?" Jake's stomach tightened. He leaned over the table and stepped toward her. The vet had been parting the husky's dense fur, examining his skin for wounds, and that was where he had discovered it. A mark, not a cut, not a scar, something else. Just behind the husky's ear, barely concealed by wet fur, was a faint, jagged insignia, carved into his skin. Jake's breath froze in his throat. "That's not natural," the assistant said quietly. Her face had gone pale. Jake stared at it. It was a tiny symbol, no bigger than a quarter, but it was distinct. Too precise to be random. It looked deliberate. "Someone put this here," Jake muttered. The vet slid a gloved finger over the mark, brow furrowed. "It's not a brand, not an infection. It almost looks burned in, but there's no indication of scarring." He shook his head. "I've never seen anything as such." Jake swallowed hard. The blood-stained note, the warning in the alley, the whisper, and now this. This wasn't simply an abandoned dog situation. This was not that, and yet it was something. The vet straightened, his gaze closing in on Jake's. "I don't know what kind of trouble you just walked into, but..." Beep. Jake flinched. The monitor next to the husky suddenly shot up. The assistant gasped. His heart rate. The husky went completely rigid. His breathing stopped. Jake didn't think. He just reacted. Hey, buddy, stay with me. The dog twitched. His limbs spasmed. His head rolled to the side. His eyes, those pale blue eyes, widened in horror. Jake seized him, ruffling his coat forcefully. Stay awake. Come on, stay with me. The husky let out a sound, a strangled, choked whimper. But his eyes didn't move to Jake. They looked past him, over his shoulder. Jake froze. A shiver ran through the room. The air turned ice cold. And then, the lights went out. The darkness. Total silence. Jake's breath caught. The darkness was dense, so absolute that it was claustrophobic. The only sound was the quick beeping of the monitors. Then, something moved, a shift in the air. Not from the vet, not from the assistant, something else. Jake's instincts screamed. He turned fast. His eyes fought to adjust, scouring the blackness. Then, a whisper, a breath against his ear. You should not have brought him here. It was a shock. Jake's whole body froze, and then the lights flashed back on. It was business as usual. The machines hummed. The room was precisely as it had been previously, except for one thing. The husky was looking straight ahead, and his whole body was shaking, and terror filled his eyes. Jake breathed out, stepping back, his heart racing. He slowly turned to the vet. Tell me you heard that. The vet's face was ashen. His assistant appeared to be going faint. The vet swallowed and clung to the edge of the table. I heard it. Jake's hands clenched into fists. Something was happening, something beyond each of them. And it had only just begun. Those words still rang in Jake's ears. They weren't imagined. They weren't a hallucination. They were real. And he wasn't the only one who listened. The vet was still holding on to the edge of the table, his knuckles pale. His aide appeared as if she wanted to flee. And the husky was shivering like crazy. Jake had a pounding in his head. He'd seen plenty in his career. Blazes that consumed entire buildings in seconds. Rescues in which everything rested on the last breath. But this was something else. We need to go, Jake said. And he said it in a firm voice, and his body was already moving. He wasn't sure where the words were coming from. Instinct, just survival. The vet blinked. Go. Go where? Anywhere but here. The vet faltered, as if ready to put up a fight, but something in Jake's face seemed to halt him. He swallowed and nodded. Jake reached for the husky. He wasn't going to leave him behind, not for anything, not after everything. But as his hands closed around the dog's quaking body, the lights blinked once more. And then, it was a total blackout. Total, utter silence. Jake sensed the change in the air before he even saw it. A chill had settled like a cold mantle, as though they were caught in the center of a frozen tundra. The suddenly frosty air turned his breath into a thin mist. And then, the husky's body went rigid. He stared with his blue eyes, wide at something just beyond Jake's shoulder. Jake didn't turn. He didn't want to. But something within him, that primal, instinctive drive to survive, pushed him to get up and move. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head, and his blood ran cold. Because in the dark, at the far end of the room, was a figure, tall, motionless, a silhouette in the dim emergency light flooding the hallway door. Jake's breath hitched. It wasn't moving, but it was there, watching, waiting. His heart thundered in his chest. The vet whispered, "Jake." Jake didn't answer. For the second the vet spoke, the figure turned its head. A slow, deliberate motion. Jake's stomach clenched. "Don't move," he whispered. The vet didn't. Neither did his assistant. It was as if the whole room stood still. And then, the husky unleashed a low, guttural growl. The figure moved. Fast. Too fast. One moment it was across the room. The next, it was smack in front of them. Jake reacted. He scrambled for the husky, jerking him into his arms just as the vet yelled. The assistant collapsed, and then everything went haywire. The escape. Jake ran. He didn't think, didn't stop. He simply seized hold of the husky and ran toward the exit. The vet behind him was gasping, stumbling. His assistant wasn't moving. Jake didn't dare look back. It was a dark hallway, the only source of light coming from a red exit sign at the end of the corridor. Almost there. Jake's lungs burned. The husky was a weight, but he was fueled by adrenaline. Fingers crossed, but the vet was close behind. His breath was ragged. Jake reached the door first. His other hand banged on the push bar. Nothing. It didn't budge. Panic shot through him. He pushed again, harder. The door wouldn't move. "It's locked," the vet gasped. "It can't be," Jake snapped. This was a fire exit. It was never locked. And yet, it was. Jake spun around and pressed against the cold metal. And that's when he saw it. The shadow. It was coming, fast, flowing like liquid, like it was above the same laws that governed everything else. Jake's fingers quaked as they tightened around the door handle once more. He did not know what awaited for them. But he knew one thing. If they weren't getting out now, they'd never get out. And then, bang! Something hit the door from outside. Jake's breath hitched, and then, all of a sudden, the lock turned. The door opened itself. Jake didn't question it. He ran. The street. He was met with a wall of cold night air. As soon as they fell onto the wet pavement outside, the door slammed behind them. Jake whirled, gasping. The veterinarian dropped to the ground, hacking. The husky was shaking still, breath shallow, still was breathing, still alive. Jake turned back to the door. There was nothing there. No shadow, no figure. Just an empty corridor behind a thick pane of glass. But Jake knew what he saw, and worst of all, he knew it wasn't over. The husky gave a soft, broken whimper. Jake looked down and rubbed his hand over the dog's head. "You're okay," he muttered. "You're okay." But the husky still had its eyes wide, staring at something no one else could see. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Jake wished they had stayed, because whatever was coming, it wasn't done with them yet. Jake stood in the night, rain drizzling from the sky in the mid-fall breeze, breaths threading in and out as they came. The husky was still shuddering in his arms, his body too weak, but those piercing blue eyes of his were trained on the glass door of the vet clinic. Staring, watching, as if waiting for something to walk in. Jake didn't turn back. He didn't want to. He had seen enough blazing structures to recognize one simple, universal truth. When you get away from something dangerous, you don't go back in to see if it's still there. He made himself breathe, to ground himself. His heart was still racing, and his skin glistened in the chill night air. Beside him, the veterinarian was slumped against the sidewalk, hands shaking. His assistant, she was still in the building. Jake had no idea whether she was alive. He knew that if he returned for her, he might not get out the second time, and something informed him that it was just what it wanted. The sound was choked, and the vet was hoarse as he croaked. What? What the hell was that? Jake shook his head. I don't know, but that was a lie. Because deep in his gut, he did know. This was the dog that was attached to something old, something watching. And whatever that was, it wasn't finished with them yet. The streets felt wrong. They needed to get away, far away. But as Jake stepped toward his truck, he had a thought. The street was too quiet. The city was never silent, not completely. There were always faraway car horns, a hum of electricity, the murmuring of life going on somewhere just beyond the reach. But now, nothing. The rain didn't even make noise when it met concrete. Jake's entire body tensed. This wasn't right. He swallowed thickly, readjusting his grip on the Husky, his gaze dropping to the desolate road, as if the world had simply stood still, like waiting for someone to take a breath. The Husky let out a low whimper, nudging his cold nose against Jake's arm. The dog could feel it too. "Come on," Jake muttered, dispelling the unease. "We're leaving." He acted quickly, yanking open the door to his truck and climbing inside, holding the Husky in his arms. The vet paused for half a second before going after him. The instant the doors slammed shut, Jake turned the key. The engine didn't start. Jake's chest tightened. He turned the key again. Click, nothing. His jaw clenched. He pressed his foot hard against the gas pedal, turning the key with more force. Click, click, click. Still nothing. "Oh, come on," Jake muttered quietly. The vet shuffled uncomfortably beside him. "Maybe the battery's dead." "It's not the battery," Jake said sharply. He knew his truck. He had driven it for years. No way that battery just died like that. It was unable to start. The Husky emitted a short bark. Jake flinched. The dog was not barking at him. He was yelling at the rearview mirror. Jake's breath hitched. His fingers curled into the wheel. His eyes rose to the mirror, slowly, hesitantly, and his stomach dropped. Because in the glass, there in the middle of the deserted street, was the shadow. It had followed them. The thing in the mirror. Jake's whole body went stiff. The vet inhaled sharply and let it free. "What the hell is that?" Jake didn't answer, because in the mirror, the shadow was no longer still. It was moving, not walking, gliding. Ears pinned back, body taut against Jake's lap, the Husky growled. He was afraid, but he wasn't turning away, and neither could Jake. The shadow moved closer and closer. Jake gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles whitened. The vet's breathing grew shallow. "Start the truck, Jake." Jake turned the key again. Click, click, click. The shadow was almost at the truck. Jake's heart beat heavily against his ribs. One more try. It was an act by the turn, harder than it had been. And the truck roared to life. Jake didn't think. He didn't breathe. He literally stomped the gas pedal. The truck slammed forward, its tires screeching on the damp pavement. And in the mirror, the shadow wasn't moving. It just stood there, watching, waiting, like it knew they weren't going to be able to run forever. The road ahead. They drove. Fast. Jake's hands never released the wheel. His pulse never slowed. The city lights streaked past them, the rain skewering the windshield in silver ribbons. The Husky lay curled against his chest, his breaths still uneven but steady. Jake did not know where he was going. He just knew he had to keep going, because something was following them, something unnatural. And worst of all, and he had the sense this was not the first time it had tracked someone down. The idea wormed its way into Jake's head and wouldn't let go. The truck rumbled along deserted streets, headlights slicing through the rain. The windshield wipers moved back and forth over the glass, but the steady beat didn't drown out the thumping of Jake's own heart. He had to think. The Husky was curled in his lap, still trembling, his blue eyes wide with something deeper than fear, understanding. Jake could feel the dog's heart racing against his arm. He wasn't just scared. He knew something Jake didn't. and that scared him even more. The vet sat stiffly beside him, his hands clamped on the dashboard as if he expected the truck to suddenly be whipped from the road. They were away from the vet clinic. They had entered the realm of the light, but Jake knew better. They weren't safe. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The shadow had let them go, for now, but it hadn't disappeared. It was waiting. A road with no end. Jake gripped the wheel pressed tight. He had to determine where to go. The fire station, number he could not afford to put the crew at risk. A hotel, a motel, somewhere public. Would that even help? Would walls and locks even make a difference? Jake puffed out air, rubbing his hand down his face. He could sense fatigue creeping in, yet he wouldn't allow himself to acknowledge it. He did not have the luxury of slowing down. The silence was finally broken by the vet. "Jake, where on earth are you taking me?" Jake never looked up from the road. "Somewhere that isn't here." The vet chuckled dryly, humorlessly. "That's not an answer." "It's the best I have right now," Jake hissed. The vet shook his head. "Look, man, I don't know what is going on, but we can't just drive it forever." Jake knew that. He simply couldn't think of anything better. But then, the husky uttered a soft whimper. Jake looked down. The dog's eyelids were half closed, exhaustion weighing him down. Fighting to stay awake. Don't let him fall asleep. That warning blared in Jake's mind. His chest tightened. What would happen if the dog shut his eyes? He didn't want to find out. "Hey, buddy," Jake said, leaning down to rub the husky's head. "Stay with me, all right?" The dog blinked up at him. And then his ears perked. The husky's body went rigid. His breathing stilled. His head snapped in the direction of the rearview mirror. Jake's stomach twisted. Gradually, dread pooling in his blood, he raised his head, and he stared, and his breath choked in his throat. The mirror. Initially, it was merely their reflection. The truck's interior. The rain-shined road behind them. But then it changed. Jake blinked, fighting to process what he was seeing. The street behind them wasn't the same street. The lights were gone. The rain had stopped. And in its stead was not the same. A road, but just not the one they were driving on. This one went on forever into an abyss. No buildings, no city, no life. Just blackness, an empty, hollow space. And in the middle of that road, there was something standing there. The shadow. Jake's hands tightened on the wheel. It wasn't chasing them. It wasn't even moving. It was just there, waiting, watching. Like it knew precisely where they were headed, for they could run no matter how far. It was already on its road. Jake's breath hitched. Everything in him cried out to do something. But before he could react, the husky started growling, low, deep. It was a noise of raw, primal fear. And then, the engine of the truck sputtered. Jake's heart nearly stopped. The vet sat up straighter. "What was that?" Jake didn't answer. He simply pressed down harder on the gas, but the truck slowed. The speedometer ticked down. The rain outside blurred. Everything shifted. The mirror, not a reflection anymore. Jake's pulse pounded, because suddenly the road ahead of them wasn't the road they had been on. It was the road behind them in the mirror, the black void, the never-ending expanse of nothingness. And the truck had stopped proceeding forward. It was being pulled, dragged, to the figure standing in the distance. The vet drew a sharp breath. "Jake!" the husky barked, loud, sharp. The noise cut through the air like a gunshot, and then everything snapped back. The truck surged forward so violently Jake almost lost control. The mirror flickered. Once, twice, and the normal street reappeared. They were back. The vet was panting beside him. The husky was still growling. And Jake had never been more sure about anything in his life. It was not just something they were running from. They were already ensnared in it. And whatever was after them, it wasn't bound by reality. It was drawing them into its world, and next time, it wouldn't let them go. Jake gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breath came short, his pulse thundering in his ears. He could still see it, that empty road in the mirror, the endless void, the shadow lurking at the end. And worse, for those few seconds, they were drawn inside. If the husky hadn't barked, if something hadn't jolted him back to reality, Jake clenched his jaw. He couldn't imagine what might have happened otherwise. The tires of the truck screeched on the wet pavement as he made a sharp turn onto an unfamiliar road. He didn't care where they were headed. He just had to keep moving. Next to him, the vet was still panting, his face bleached, his hands quaking. He had seen it too. The husky, curled against Jake's lap, had stopped trembling. His body was not limp. It was taut, bracing, aware. His eyes, blue, shot toward every shadow that crossed the window. He was watching, waiting. He knew this wasn't over, and so did Jake. The symbol. Jake didn't slow until they were out of the city limits. An empty road, trees on either side, darkness beyond the headlights. Eventually, he came up to a stop, silencing the engine. As soon as the truck stopped making noise, the world seemed wrong again. Jake let out a long sigh, dragging his hands across his face. His mind was racing. His body was exhausted. But he was at no time able to shut down. "Okay," he said finally, hoarse. "We have to find out what's happening." The vet gave a surprised laugh. "You're just now figuring that out." Jake ignored him. His eyes wandered over to the husky. The dog was still taut, still listening to something they could not hear, and that's when Jake had a recollection. "The mark," he muttered. The vet blinked. "What?" Jake twisted in his seat, his hands instinctively riffling through the husky's thick fur, parting it gently behind the ear, where they first spotted it. And there it was, the jagged, burned-in symbol. Except now, it was different. Jake's stomach twisted. It changed. The vet leaned in, catching his own breath. That's impossible. But it wasn't. Because the mark, this was it growing. What had once been a simple symbol the size of a quarter had spread. The lines were longer now, branching out in throaty, curling shapes, like veins crawling under the husky's skin. And worse, the edges were glowing. A faint, eerie blue, about the same color as the husky's eyes. Jake's pulse spiked. "What the hell is happening?" the vet whispered. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't, because the husky started to breathe differently. It was deeper now, stronger. And then the dog moved. For the first time since Jake had discovered him in that alley, the husky rose to his feet. As his legs remained shaky, he managed nonetheless, shifting his body forward, climbing up onto the seat, his head opening toward the window of the truck, his eyes fixed on something. Jake followed his gaze, and his whole body went cold. There, in the tree line, just out of the reach of the headlights, was the shadow. It was here. It had found them. The voice. Jake's breath hitched. His body froze. The vet made a strangled sound, his whole body scrunching back against the seat. "It's here," he whispered. Jake's instincts were howling to run. Something, however, rooted him in place, something unnatural. And then the husky growled. It was a bass, visceral sound, one that keyed Jake's spine. The dog didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply stood there and stared into the dark, ears pinned back, body tense. And then it spoke. The voice spoke out from the shadows, software hollow, ancient. "You have no idea what you've ingested." Jake's stomach lurched. He bunched his fingers into fists. His body recoiled at the sound of that voice. The husky barked, one single, sharp sound that pierced the night like a warning shot. The shadow tilted its head, amused. "You think you can save him?" The words crawled in the air, heavy and stifling. Jake's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to answer. He was not going to let this thing get in his head, but then the husky looked at him. And for the first time since Jake found him, he made a sound. Not a growl, not a bark, a whimper. Desperate, pained. A sound that said, "Please." Jake swallowed hard. He made a decision. "Get in the back," he instructed the vet. The man hesitated. "What?" "Now." This time the vet didn't argue. He crawled over seats, pressing himself to the back, putting as much distance as possible between him and whatever was outside. Jake went for the husky, sliding him up next to him in slow motion. The dog let him, and that's when Jake said low and steady, "I don't know what you are. I don't know why you want him. But if you want to take him, then you're going to have to go through me." Silence. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing moved. And then, the thing in the trees made a laugh. Software faint, bone-chilling. And then it was gone. The air shifted. Normal temperature was restored. The burden that had sat on Jake's chest dissipated. But the feeling in his gut, that told him the truth. This wasn't over, not even close. The husky exhaled sharply, pushing his nose into Jake's arm. Jake rubbed a hand across his head, his heart still pounding. Whatever this goddamned thing was, it wasn't done with them. It was simply toying with its food. And Jake knew, in his heart of hearts, when they next saw it, it wouldn't let them free. That voice. It still rang in Jake's ears, coiling around his thoughts like a noose. It had spoken to him, not the way human beings speak to one another, but in a way that made his very bones quake, like it had crawled into his skull, tethered itself around his mind, and left a scorch mark. Jake sat straight-backed behind the wheel, fingers curled around the steering wheel. His breathing was shallow. His pulse was erratic. But worst of all, the husky was still shaking. Jake had seen fear in animals before. He had saved dogs from burning buildings, dragged them from fallen-in houses, seen them shake in the wreckage. But this wasn't fear. This was something else. It had a kind of terror I hadn't felt before. Not the one that was instinct, the kind of terror that stemmed from knowledge. And Jake had the sickening impression this husky knew precisely what that thing was. The vet still sat in the back seat, looking blankly out the window, fingers trembling against his knees. He hadn't said a thing since the shadow was gone. Neither had Jake, because there was nothing more to say. They weren't running anymore. They weren't escaping, because this thing was not chasing them. It was toying with them. It wanted them to know, to understand, that no matter where they went, they were already caught. The night won't end. Jake took a deep breath, willing himself to concentrate. He needed a plan, some kind of strategy. But first, he needed to see what he was dealing with. He turned toward the vet. "You're a scientist, right?" The vet gave a blink, as if he'd just been pulled out of a trance. "What? You believe in facts, logic, biology? You don't believe in ghosts or curses or anything like that?" The vet hesitated. No, of course not." "Well, explain what's going," Jake said. The vet opened his mouth, then closed it. He swallowed hard. His throat bobbed. "I can't." Jake exhaled slowly. That was what he thought. But he needed answers. His gaze moved to the Husky. The mark behind his ear still glowed faintly, the lines curling and shifting as if it was alive. "This is not a typical brand," Jake said between murmurs. "It's changing." The vet leaned in, examining the mark closely. His face was still white, but the scientific side of him was beginning to dominate. Analyzing, thinking. "It kind of looks like a sigil," he muttered. Jake's brow furrowed. "A what?" "A sigil. A symbol that is used for rituals, protection, or..." He paused. "Binding." Jake's stomach twisted. "Binding to what?" The vet swallowed hard. "I don't know. However, if the symbol is changing, then whatever it was doing before, it's not finished yet." Jake clenched his jaw. The Husky gave a quiet whimper. He raised his head and his ears twitched. He was listening. Jake ran a hand over the dog's fur, anchoring himself. "Okay," he muttered. "Let's think this through. That thing, whatever it is, it wants him. Why?" The vet hesitated. "Because he's marked." Jake exhaled. That much was obvious. "Then we've got to find out what the hell this mark is, and more importantly, how to break it." The first rule. Jake twisted the key in the ignition. The truck rumbled to life. The vet looked up, startled. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," Jake said under his breath. "There's no safe," the vet responded right away. Jake's fingers stiffened on the wheel. He knew that. He felt it in his bones. But sitting here, doing nothing, that wasn't an option. As he drove down the road, the headlights sliced through the continuous rain, reflections of the waterlogged ground bouncing back at them. Jake didn't check the rear view. He didn't want to know what was waiting there. The Husky shifted in his lap. He was still weak, still on the mend, but now there was a new tension in his body. A focus, like he had information that Jake didn't, and then he moved. Not much, just enough to elbow Jake's arm. Jake glanced down. The Husky was looking at the dashboard clock. Jake's brow furrowed. The time hadn't changed. Still 3:17 a.m. For 20 minutes, it had been 3:17 a.m. Jake's heart stopped. He checked his phone. 3:17 a.m. He glanced at the digital clock on the radio. 3:17 a.m. His skin went ice cold. "Jake," the vet said suddenly, his voice hoarse. Jake didn't look up. He was still watching the clock. "Jake." Finally, Jake ripped his gaze away and followed the vet's gaze. And his stomach dropped. The street ahead of them, it was the same street. The same stretch of road, the same streetlights, the same flickering neon sign of the gas station they had driven past 10 minutes before. They weren't moving forward. They were looping. Jake tightened his grip on the wheel. "No way," the vet whispered. The Husky growled softly, and then the radio crackled. Jake's breath hitched. The radio was off, but now a voice filtered through the speakers. Not static, not distortion, a voice. "You are beginning to see now, aren't you?" Jake's blood ran cold. The vet gasped, his whole body going stiff. The Husky whimpered. Jake didn't speak. He stared at the radio, heart pounding against his skull. The voice laughed. Low, slow, amused. "You thought you could run?" The truck lurched. The headlights flickered. And in that instant, Jake spotted it. Not in the mirror, not in the road. You're in the rearview mirror. The shadow sat in the back seat, watching them, smiling. Jake's breath stopped. And then the truck engine died. The lights went out. The road disappeared. And Jake finally understood they were never running. They were already caught. The voice slipped into Jake's mind, curled around his lungs. The truck was dead. By contrast, the world outside was a hollow void, formless and empty, extending without end in all directions. And in the reflection of the windshield, the shadow was grinning. Jake's fingers twitched. His breathing was ragged. He was frozen beside me, eyes wide with unspeakable terror. The husky shook, his pale blue eyes glued to the thing that had haunted them from the very start. "Let him go," Jake forced out, his voice little more than a whisper. The shadow tilted its head, mocking. "He was never yours to save." Jake's jaw clenched. There had to be a way out. His hands clutched the husky's fur tighter. The dog wasn't just shaking now. He was looking at Jake, like he was biding his time for something. Jake's pulse spiked, and then he understood. This was never about getting away. It was about breaking the cycle. Jake inhaled sharply, the muscles coiling like springs. "You want him," he whispered. The shadow didn't respond, but Jake felt its amusement. He exhaled, and then he made his choice. Jake let go. Not in surrender, not in fear, in trust. The moment his hands left the husky's fur, the world broke. Light, blinding, overwhelming light. The darkness screamed, the truck shuddered violently, metal scraping, reality twisting. And then silence. The morning after, Jake gasped awake. The truck was sitting on an empty road, the sun was rising, and next to him, the husky was curled up, breathing steadily. Alive. Jake's breath hitched. The threat was gone. Everything was normal, as if nothing had ever occurred. But Jake knew better, because when he turned, when he faced the husky, the scar behind his ear was gone, and for the first time since they had first met, the wiggly leg of that husky wagged. Jake let out a breath that he hadn't realized he'd been holding, trembling. What had happened last night? He had won. But deep down, he knew. It was still out there, watching, waiting. But for now, Jake did escape, and so did the husky. And that was enough.